Significant legislation regarding gay and transgender rights went down to defeat this week in Houston, America's fourth largest city. So what happened? Originally, the legislation was passed by the city council and then, for procedural reasons, went to a public vote. And after a year of bitter fighting, by an almost 2-to-1 margin, citizens of Houston turned away a law that exists in almost every other major American city, including the three that are ahead of it in population: New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, not to mention dozens of others. Now, the reason the thing failed ostensibly was because of unrealistic and inaccurate fears that were spread by opponents of the legislation. And it is both easy and justifiable to rail against those tactics, suggesting that men would go into women's bathrooms without permission, and that sexual offenders would have free reign, and your grandmother wouldn't be safe going to the toilet, as posters were, publicizing. But it's also really important to understand, why did such an outrageous campaign that was almost entirely based on fiction work as well as it did, given that so many people before that campaign were actually supportive of this legislation? And I think it happened because, is so often the case, people play into the hands of their opponents with the best of intentions, but for very bad reasons and in really unhealthy ways. What happened here, I think, is that rather than respond by saying, that won't happen, you fearmongers can raise those fears, but we're going to change this legislation, foreclose on that option, by putting in language that I know for some people would really be problematic. Language that would say, when it comes to locker rooms and bathrooms and things like that, effectively, if you have male parts, you gotta use a men's room. And if you have women's parts, you gotta use a women's room. And I do understand that relative to a range of issues, for a relatively small number of people, but they're real issues, that can do really dangerous and uncomfortable things to their gender and sexual identity. But I also know that it's really important not to let the perfect get in the way of the good, especially when it comes to things as sensitive to large numbers of people as gender and sexual identity. I can't help but think that, as vicious and misguided as the campaign against this legislation sometimes was, the very people who wanted this legislation to pass, by not taking seriously the fears and anxieties of their opponents, let an opportunity go by which, while it wouldn't have been a perfect solution, would have left Houston a safer place for more of its citizens today than it was last week, and will continue to be for the time being.